They called her just a nurse. Dr. Hargrove had already decided that much before she finished hanging the first 4 bag on the morning of her shift. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial's 4th-floor corridors with the kind of invisible efficiency that made people forget she'd been in the room at all. That was the point. Hannah Clarke had spent 18 years learning how to disappear into the work itself, letting the competent speak while the rest of her stayed buried so deep that even the fluorescent lights couldn't find her. But what Dr. Hargrove didn't see was the knife scar running down her left forearm when she adjusted the patient's full pole. He didn't see the way her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had held dying soldiers together while rounds came through walls made of sand. He didn't see Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke at all. He just saw a nurse who kept her head down, and that made her invisible, and that made her, in his calculation, irrelevant. The shift started at 6:30 in the morning, before the hospital was fully awake, when the antiseptic smell was still strong enough to mask everything underneath. Hannah arrived 15 minutes early, as she always did, moving through the employee entrance with a faded keycard clipped to her scrubs. The locker room was empty except for the fluorescent hum that filled every corner of Oak Creek Memorial like a constant white noise that became the soundtrack of her days. She opened her locker to the same metal shelves she'd organized exactly the same way for 7 years. Work shoes on the bottom shelf. Spare scrubs folded with military precision. And underneath, in the back corner where no one ever looked, a pair of worn combat boots stuffed with something that caught the light when she opened the locker door. Something metallic. Something that clinked softly when shifted. Hannah's hand moved toward them instinctively, then stopped. She touched the leather once, just once, feeling the wear patterns her fingers knew as well as her own heartbeat, and then she closed the locker door without opening it any further. The sound echoed in the empty locker room like a final word. She moved through morning rounds with practiced invisibility, her limp barely perceptible as she favored her left leg, a favor she'd learned to give it 8 years ago in a place that didn't exist on any map she would ever acknowledge. Her movements were economical, purposeful, everything calculated to take up as little space as possible. In Trauma Bay 2, she adjusted the monitors on a post-operative patient who'd come through Dr. Hargrove's service the day before. The man was stable but uncomfortable, his surgical dressing already weeping slightly at the edges. She replaced it with the smooth certainty of someone who had performed this action 5,000 times before, her hands moving like apex predators that had already learned their prey's movements. No wasted motion. No hesitation. When she reached the medication cart to verify the ordering nurse had entered the correct dosage for post-op analgesia, she caught an error that would have given the patient 5 micrograms instead of 50. She flagged it with a note in the chart. Then she moved on, unchanged. The other nurses on the 4th floor had learned years ago that Hannah Clarke didn't gossip. She didn't complain. She didn't even really socialize in the way that hospital people did, the way that made things easier or harder depending on whose side you were on. She just worked. By 8:30, Dr. Hargrove arrived for rounds. He was impossible to miss in his tailored navy suit, his expensive watch catching the light as he moved through the unit with the kind of focused energy that made other people straighten their spines. He was 53 years old, had been the chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial for 11 years, and had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. His power came from 3 sources: the hospital board members who owed him favors because he brought in revenue, the equipment suppliers who sent him cases of wine at Christmas in exchange for inflated billing codes on their products, and the simple fact that nobody wanted to be the person who challenged him. Nobody wanted their schedule rearranged. Nobody wanted to be the reason their department's funding got reduced in the next budget cycle. Dr. Hargrove knew all of this. He moved through the unit like a man who had already calculated every outcome and found them all acceptable. He glanced at Hannah once as she documented her findings in a chart, really looked at her for a moment with the clinical precision he usually reserved for surgical reviews. She was competent. That was clear. Her documentation was meticulous, her technical skills solid, her patient's outcomes stable. But competence without ambition was just labor. She was precisely the kind of nurse who would never make trouble, never push for anything, never want anything beyond her shift ending on time. She was, in his quick assessment, utterly unremarkable. What he didn't account for was that Hannah Clarke had spent the last 7 years noticing things, documenting everything, and trusting patterns the way other people trusted their instincts. The post-surgical patient in Trauma Bay 3 should have been charged $4,700 for a titanium spinal fusion implant. Hannah had reviewed the surgical report, cross-referenced it with the implant inventory logs, and noticed that the billable code on the patient's chart listed a more expensive model, one that cost $6,400. The difference was $2,300. A single difference. A small discrepancy. Hannah opened the patient's chart at the nursing station and documented her observation in a clear, organized note to the surgical coordinator. Just the facts. The code number. The implant serial number from inventory. The cost difference. The date and time. Her name and credentials. She didn't speculate. She didn't accuse. She just documented what she'd seen, the way she'd been trained to document everything, with precision and without judgment. Then she moved on to the next task. The phone call came at 9:15. Dr. Hargrove's voice on the other end had the texture of something being held under tight control. My office. 5 minutes. Hannah finished charting the vital signs she was in the middle of recording, saved the entry, and walked upstairs without changing her pace. His office was on the 6th floor, a space that looked like a magazine photograph of what success should look like: leather furniture, an oil painting of a sailboat, a glass desk that had no clutter on it whatsoever. Dr. Hargrove was standing when she entered, his jacket already off, his sleeves rolled up in a way that was meant to suggest approachability. It didn't. He had his hands clasped in front of him, the way a surgeon might hold his hands right before making an incision. You left a note in the chart, he said. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just the opening salvo of something he'd already decided. Hannah stood in the doorway, her hands relaxed at her sides. Yes, doctor. About the billing code for the implant. The documentation showed a discrepancy between the item billed and the inventory log. Dr. Hargrove smiled. It was a smile like a wolf showing its teeth, impressive in its precision but wrong in its lack of warmth. I appreciate attention to detail, Hannah. I do. But billing codes aren't your lane. That's not nursing. That's administrative. That's something the billing department handles. He moved around the desk with the kind of fluid certainty that suggested he'd made this speech before and would make it many times again. Raising concerns about procedures, about things you don't fully understand, that's not helpful. That's actually problematic. It wastes time. It creates confusion. And confusion in a hospital environment is dangerous. Hannah stood very still. Her jaw tightened, but only slightly. Only enough that someone paying very close attention would notice her taking control of something inside herself. The codes didn't match, she said. Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that came from practice. I documented what I observed. And I'm asking you not to do that again. Dr. Hargrove moved back behind his desk, his tone shifting into something softer, more collegial. A sting wrapped in velvet. You're a good nurse, Hannah. Solid. Reliable. The kind of person this hospital needs. But you need to understand the boundaries of your role. You take care of patients. You execute the doctor's orders. You document clinical observations. You don't question procedures or billing practices or the decisions made by the surgical department. That's not your job. And if you make it your job, well. He let that sentence hang in the air like a threat that didn't need to be finished. I'd hate to see someone like you get labeled as a troublemaker. That kind of reputation follows you. I understand, Hannah said. Do you? He watched her the way a predator watches prey that hasn't run yet. Because understanding is important. Knowing your place is important. Hospitals are complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. A lot of things that a floor nurse might not understand or have context for. The best nurses, the ones who move up, who get better assignments, who get remembered when it's time for promotions, those nurses know not to ask questions about things that aren't their concern. Those nurses are team players. Hannah's hands were still relaxed. Her breathing hadn't changed. The limp that usually marked her left side was invisible now, her weight distributed with the muscular control of someone trained to remain still under pressure. "I won't document billing codes again." "Good," Dr. Hargrove said. "That's good. I'm glad we understand each other." He returned to his desk and opened a file, effectively dismissing her with the same efficiency he used to dismiss post-operative complications. "You can get back to work now." Hannah turned and walked out of his office without another word. The elevator ride back down to the 4th floor took 47 seconds. She counted them the way she used to count seconds between mortar rounds, the way her body had been trained to count time in units that meant the difference between living and not living. When the doors opened, she stepped back into the fluorescent hum of the hospital corridors and moved directly to a patient's room to check on post-operative pain levels. By 9:30, her interaction with Dr. Hargrove was already beginning to feel like something that had happened to someone else. But it wasn't finished. Not even close. By 10 o'clock, Dr. Hargrove had made 3 phone calls. The first was to his contact at the billing department, a woman named Michelle who had been sending him envelopes of bonus checks for 6 years in exchange for the kind of documentation that made certain equipment purchases look more expensive than they were. "We might have a documentation problem on the 4th floor," he said into the phone, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing serious. Just a nurse who's a little too detail-oriented. Might need someone to have a conversation with her about appropriate boundaries." The second call was to the hospital board member who owed him the most significant favor, the one whose son had needed special orthopedic surgery that the insurance company had initially denied until Dr. Hargrove made 2 well-placed phone calls to people with influence. "Just want you to know that there's a nurse on my service who's asking questions she shouldn't be asking. I'm handling it, but you might want to be aware. These kinds of people can be problematic if they're not redirected early." The third call was to his wife, telling her he'd be home late because he had paperwork to catch up on. None of these calls mentioned Hannah Clarke by name. They didn't need to. The system had already been set in motion, and systems like this one had tremendous momentum. Hannah didn't know any of this yet. She was in room 412, helping an elderly patient who'd had a knee replacement get to the bathroom without falling, her hands steady as surgical instruments, her movements precise and careful. She was thinking about whether she needed to replace the empty saline flushes on the medication cart. She was thinking about whether the patient's daughter would remember to bring the discharge paperwork from her house. She was thinking about a lot of things that didn't include Dr. Hargrove or billing codes or the way his smile hadn't reached his eyes. But somewhere in her tactical mind, the part that had kept her alive in places where the sound of helicopters meant either rescue or the end of everything, she knew that something had shifted. She didn't have the luxury of not noticing patterns. That part of her brain had been trained too well. It would keep notice, collect data, and prepare for contingencies until something finally moved from potential threat into actual danger. For now, though, the patient needed to get safely to the bathroom, and that was the only thing that mattered. The patient's daughter watched from the corner chair as Hannah finished securing the fresh gauze, her movements precise and unhurried. Mrs. Anderson, the post-surgical patient, lay still on the bed, her abdomen healing well, the incision clean and properly dressed according to protocol. Hannah had done this dressing change 1,000 times. She had done it right. The door burst open without a knock. Dr. Hargrove entered with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, his white coat billowing slightly from the force of his entrance. His presence had a quality like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and barely suppressed aggression. He didn't acknowledge Mrs. Anderson or her daughter. His eyes locked on Hannah's hands, still touching the gauze. "Nurse Clarke." His voice carried the particular loudness of a man accustomed to being heard in rooms where people feared interrupting him. "This dressing protocol is completely inadequate. How long have you been practicing? A first-year student would know better." Hannah's fingers stilled. She took one measured breath through her nose. The residents exchanged glances, the kind of quick eye contact that meant they'd been warned this was coming. The daughter in the corner stiffened, her hand moving protectively toward Mrs. Anderson's shoulder. The dressing is per your written protocol, Doctor, Hannah said quietly. Her voice had the flatness of someone reading from a document. Page 14. Subsection 3. Hargrove stepped closer, his jaw tightening. He wasn't expecting contradiction. Most people crumbled when he raised his voice in front of an audience. Most people tried to explain themselves, to defend, to placate. Hannah simply stood there, her hand steady at her sides, waiting. Perhaps if you spent less time questioning billing procedures and more time on basic nursing competence, Mrs. Anderson wouldn't be at risk of infection. The words were a knife wrapped in surgical precision. He was connecting the dots aloud, the billing discrepancy she'd documented, her refusal to sign off on questionable codes, dragging it all into the light in front of witnesses. In front of a patient. In front of a family member who would remember every word. Mrs. Anderson shifted uncomfortably. Her daughter's face had gone pale. Hannah made eye contact with Hargrove. She held it. When she spoke, her voice dropped an octave, something ancient and trained surfacing beneath the scrubs. I've carried dying men through minefields, Doctor. Your paperwork doesn't scare me. The silence that followed was the kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the ventilator in the next room wheeling its mechanical breath, the distant beep of a monitor down the hall. Hargrove's face flushed red, not the red of embarrassment but the red of a man whose authority had just been questioned in front of subordinates. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. A single tear escaped Hannah's eye. She wiped it with her thumb without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without apologizing. The tear was not weakness. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the accumulated weight of every insult, every dismissal, every moment of invisibility compressed into a single drop of salt water that she removed from her face as if it were no more significant than water from the sink. We're done here, she said to Mrs. Anderson, whose eyes had gone wide. Your dressing is perfect. I'll be back to check on you in 2 hours. Hargrove stood frozen for another 3 seconds, then turned on his heel and left, the residents scrambling after him like satellites pulled by gravity. The daughter exhaled. Mrs. Anderson reached out and squeezed Hannah's wrist. Thank you, the patient whispered. He was wrong. I could see it. You were right. Hannah nodded once and left the room before she had to respond, before she had to pretend that everything was fine, before the composure cracked any further. By that afternoon, the fabrication was already posted on the unit board in the main nursing station, the place where every single staff member passed at least twice per shift. The paper was printed on official hospital letterhead, the kind that made things seem real, official, irrevocable. Formal warning, H. Clarke. Medication errors. Patient safety concerns. Insubordination. Under review for immediate termination. No specifics. No dates. No actual incidents. Just enough to poison the water. Hannah read it standing perfectly still, her hand steady at her sides. 3 nurses witnessed her reading it. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply read every word, turned, and walked back to her assigned patients. The composure was absolute. The internal math was different, already calculating the cost, the timeline, the endgame, but externally, she was ice. By lunch, everyone had seen it. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular mustiness of a small institutional space that never quite aired out properly. Hannah entered at 12:19 p.m. carrying her meal, a sandwich she'd made that morning, an apple, a bottle of water. She'd been eating alone in her car for the past 3 months anyway, but today she needed the locker room routine, the normalcy, the small ritual of belonging somewhere. 5 nurses sat at the break room table. Veterans. 18 months of shared shifts, 18 months of good mornings and held doors and the kind of low-level camaraderie that exists in hospitals where people are exhausted and kind to each other out of sheer necessity. Sarah Chen had given her the nod when she started. Marcus had shown her where the break room was. They'd all accepted her without questioning, without digging, without needing anything from her except basic professional respect. The moment Hannah pulled out her chair, the entire table shifted. The exchange happened wordlessly. A glance. A nod. A gathering of possessions. One by one, they stood and collected their lunches, their coffee cups, their phones. Sarah, the one who'd been kindest, the one who'd actually brought her flowers when Hannah's shift overlapped with a particularly bad night, was the last. She looked at Hannah for a full 2 seconds. Her mouth formed the word sorry without sound. Then she turned and walked out, following the others. The fluorescent lights hummed. The refrigerator cycled on in the corner, its compressor whirring like something tired and mechanical. Hannah sat at the table alone, her sandwich unwrapped, untouched. She took one measured breath. Then another. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from her 13-year-old son. "What time will you be home? Coach says he needs a parent's signature on the permission slip for the tournament." She stared at the message. Typed, 6 p.m. "I'll sign it then." Deleted it. Typed, "Will be late. Maybe 7. Deleted that too. She put the phone face down on the table without responding. The sandwich sat in front of her, the edges beginning to dry slightly. She didn't touch it. In a room 7 floors above, in the cardiac monitoring unit, a 4-star general named Mitchell lay in bed 412 with a chart that told the story of a minor stroke and neurological deficits. Memory gaps. Confusion. The kind of thing that happened to men in their 60s who'd been running too fast for too long, their bodies finally catching up to their obligations. When Hannah entered to check his vitals, the general didn't recognize her. He'd spent 17 years thinking about her, wondering if she'd made it out of Sangin with her sanity intact, carrying her memory like a soldier carries a mission. His body had remembered her enough to tattoo her name on his forearm with a date beneath it, Clarke, the 14th of July, 09, the day she'd carried him out of the Jolan district under fire, his femur shattered, his blood on her hands, her voice in his ear saying, "Stay with me, sir, stay with me." But his mind had forgotten. The stroke had taken that. Taken her. He stared at her with polite blankness as she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm. His eyes moved across her face like he was reading a page in a language he no longer spoke. "How are we feeling today, sir?" she asked, her voice back to its baseline, soft, respectful, the voice of a nurse who was simply a nurse. "Fine, fine," he said. "You're good at this. I can tell." He paused, looking at his own forearm as if the tattoo might translate itself. "You're familiar somehow." Hannah's hand trembled once on the blood pressure cuff. Just once. Just enough that only she felt it. She took one measured breath and completed the reading. 142/88. Elevated. Stress response or cardiac response, the numbers didn't distinguish. "Sometimes the body remembers what the mind forgets, sir," she said quietly. She finished the vital signs, documented them with her usual meticulous precision, and left the room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for exactly 3 seconds, her eyes closed. Then she straightened, checked her watch, and moved on to the next patient. What she didn't see was Dr. Hargrove standing at the nursing station 2 floors below, reviewing the general's billing codes with the expression of a man who'd just discovered gold. High-profile patient. Department of Defense Insurance. Cardiac monitoring. Potential for significant upcharges. Potential for inflated procedures, unnecessary consultations, phantom charges that the federal system would pay without blinking. The general was an opportunity. And Hannah's assignment to his care was something else entirely, another angle, another pressure point, another way to make her position untenable. Hargrove picked up his phone and dialed the board chairman's private line. When the voice answered, Hargrove lowered his voice to the particular tone that suggested confidentiality, gravity, shared concern. "We have a situation," Hargrove said. "With one of our nursing staff. I'm not making accusations, but I'm obligated to flag some concerning patterns. Especially with the VIP patient we just admitted." The conversation lasted for minutes. In those 4 minutes, Hargrove planted 3 seeds: incompetence, insubordination, and the possibility that Hannah's presence near a high-profile military patient might constitute a liability. By 3 p.m., he'd called the nursing school where Hannah had gotten her credentials, leaving a message about reference checks that sounded routine but carried just enough implication to make anyone listening wonder. By 4 p.m., he'd scheduled an outside investigator to audit Hannah's patient files, looking for irregularities that he knew she didn't have because Hannah's documentation was immaculate, but the audit would take weeks, would create the appearance of investigation, would cast a shadow that didn't need to be true to be effective. The trap was being constructed with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before, who understood that you didn't need evidence when you had institutional power, that you didn't need truth when you had allies, that you didn't need to break someone openly when you could simply make them disappear quietly. Hannah finished her shift at 7:04 p.m. She clocked out. She drove home in the rain with her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, thinking about nothing, thinking about everything, thinking about a general who wore her name on his skin but couldn't remember why. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for 4 minutes before going inside. Her son was waiting by the window, permission slip in hand, his face still carrying the open trust of a child who didn't yet understand that the world could turn on you without warning, that the people you work beside could abandon you in silence, that sometimes saving lives was the thing that cost you everything. Her son was asleep by the time she got inside. Backpack abandoned by the kitchen table, permission slip still unsigned, homework half finished in pencil. She left it where it was and climbed the stairs on muscle memory, each step deliberate, controlled. The combat boots were still in her closet, buried under folded scrubs and winter jackets no one would ever need in Norfolk. She didn't reach for them. Not tonight. Sleep didn't come. At 3 in the morning, she gave up and showered in the dark, standing under water hot enough to raise welts, watching steam rise like the smoke from Sangin Valley rising through her closed eyelids. By 5:40, she was back at Oak Creek Memorial, her badge scanned at the employee entrance before the sun touched the eastern sky, her hand steady as surgical steel. The cardiac monitoring unit occupied the 4th floor, and the general's room was 2 doors down from the nurse's station. The name on the door read General Marcus Webb, for stars earned through operations she wasn't supposed to know details about, a career written in classified redactions and congressional medals. She'd seen him once before, 2 years ago, when he'd visited her battalion after the Sangin evacuation, older, grayer, moving with the careful precision of a man whose body carried more shrapnel than the surgeons could find. He didn't recognize her. She didn't expect him to. The monitor beside his bed showed a steady rhythm, sinus at 68, blood pressure comfortable at 128/74. His chart indicated a right-sided lacuna stroke 3 days prior, memory gaps from hour 12 onward, stroke protocol admission for cardiac observation. She scanned the orders, aspirin, atorvastatin, physical therapy cleared. Routine. Careful. The kind of admissions that made nurses good at their jobs. She pulled the privacy curtain open. General Webb lay with his left arm above the blanket, and there it was, the tattoo she'd heard about through scuttlebutt at a coffee shop 2 months ago, through a chance conversation with a former corpsman who'd seen him at Walter Reed, her name, inscribed in military Gothic script across his inner forearm, the letters dense with the kind of finality that only came from wanting to carry a name forever. Hannah Clarke, inked permanently into his skin. The general's eyes were open, tracking her movements with the careful surveillance of a man trained to read threats. His gaze dropped to the tattoo, his own forearm, and his face shifted into something like confusion, the way a linguist might stare at an alphabet they'd studied once and then forgotten. His hand lifted. He turned his wrist slowly, examining the letters as if they might suddenly translate themselves, as if memory might spring forth from the act of looking closely enough. "Do you know why that's there?" His voice carried the residual rasp of someone still healing, not quite back to full command timbre. Hannah met his eyes. "Your physical therapy notes say the stroke affected episodic memory primarily. The tattoo was done 12 years ago, sir. Before the injury. 12 years. His hand dropped back to the blanket. The morning light through the window caught the ink, made the letters sharper. "I know what it says. I just don't know why it says it." She checked the 4-line, the monitor leads, the glucose level on his bedside monitor. Routine. Professional. The kind of distance she'd learned to keep from things that mattered. Someone you saved. That's what the hospital records say. Someone I saved. He stared at his arm like it belonged to a stranger. I've saved a lot of people. That's what they trained me for. By evening rounds, his oxygen saturation was holding at 97%, his telemetry clean, his vital signs the picture of stability. The stroke team was satisfied. Neurology cleared him for step-down care within 48 hours. Everything was progressing as planned, which meant everything was about to go catastrophically wrong. That's how these things worked in Hannah's experience, in hospitals, and in war. The moment the monitors looked good was the moment you stopped paying attention, and that was the moment something in the human body decided to fail. She was checking the evening medications at 23:56 when she heard it, not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The general's breathing pattern had changed. Where it had been steady and deep, now it was shallow, rapid, the kind of quick gasping that came from the body struggling to pull oxygen through obstruction. His oxygen saturation was 92%. Then 90. Then 88 and falling. She moved to his bedside without calling for help first. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis hit her like muscle memory, like her hands already knew what her mind was calculating. Puncture in the lung, air leaking into the pleural space, building pressure that collapsed the lung and twisted the mediastinum, pushing the heart aside like a fist closing around the circulatory system. The general's eyes went wide. He tried to sit up. She pressed her hand to his shoulder, not unkindly, but firm, the way you held something in place before it could fall apart. I need to page the resident, she said. Her voice was that of a nurse now, not a soldier. Calm. Measured. Professional. And Dr. Hargrove. She hit the call button, watching the saturation drop to 85. The intercom crackled, code blue was called 6 minutes out. The rapid response team couldn't get here faster than the fact that tissue was already beginning to suffer, that the general's blue-tinged lips were the least of what was happening inside his chest. She moved to the equipment cart, found the needle decompression kit, 14-gauge angiocath, sterile field, the kind of intervention that existed in that space between life and catastrophic organ failure. Dr. Hargrove arrived in under 3 minutes, still buttoning his white coat, his face already arranged in the expression of mild irritation that had become his baseline around her. Behind him came the 2 residents, Rodriguez and Chen, third-year residents who'd learned their protocols from attending who wanted them to look impressed rather than competent. What do we have? Hargrove moved toward the bed without actually looking at the patient yet. Acute respiratory distress, O2 sat 79 and dropping, Hannah said. She was already prepping the decompression site, her hands moving through the procedures with the precision of someone who'd done this before, not in a hospital, but in the back of a Chinook helicopter over Sangin, with artillery whistling overhead and a soldier's collapsed lung killing him faster than infection could. The general's trachea had deviated visibly now, his jugular veins distended like cords, the clinical signs of increased intrathoracic pressure screaming what was happening, a pneumothorax converting to tension, air accumulating faster than it could escape, the pressure climbing, the lung flattening, the mediastinum shifting, the heart being crushed. Step back, Nurse Clarke, Hargrove said. He was positioning himself between her and the patient now, his voice loud enough for the residents to hear clearly, loud enough for the general to hear, though his eyes were already losing focus. We'll prepare for intubation. Page for the crash cart. Sir, he's got minutes, not hours. Hannah didn't step back. Her hands remained steady, the needle kit visible in her grip. The lung is collapsed. That's not a respiratory depression problem that intubation fixes. That's a tension pneumothorax requiring immediate decompression. I will not have a nurse with documented competency issues performing invasive procedures on a 4-star general. His voice dropped an octave, shifted from irritated to something harder. That's an order, Nurse Clarke. Step away from the patient. Now. The monitors were alarming in discrete, rhythmic beats, the sound of a body organizing its own shutdown, oxygen saturation at 76, heart rate climbing to 118, the rhythm still sinus but thready, compressed, struggling against pressure it couldn't overcome. Rodriguez and Chen were frozen in the doorway, waiting for Hargrove's direction, trained to defer to hierarchy over evidence. Hannah calculated the cost with the kind of cold precision that had kept her alive in Sangin. Obey Hargrove, and the general died, his heart eventually stopping as the pressure crushed it, as organs failed in cascade. Act now, and she was finished at Oak Creek Memorial, terminated before nightfall, security escorting her out a second time, her son waiting by the kitchen table with another permission slip nobody would sign. She looked at the general's face, older now, marked by the stroke, unfocused with dying brain function. She looked at his forearm, at the letters of her name inscribed there, at this man who'd loved her enough to carry her forward into his skin even though he couldn't remember why. The monitors screamed. Her hands moved. The monitors screamed. Her hands moved. She didn't think about Dr. Hargrove standing 3 feet away. Didn't think about protocol or hierarchy or the fact that she'd already crossed a line by pushing past him. Her hands moved because a man was dying. Because his oxygen saturation was 68 and dropping. Because his trachea was deviated so far to the right that it looked like something inside him had snapped. The general's breath came in shallow gasps, the sound of a man drowning in air that couldn't reach his lungs. Tension pneumothorax. One collapsed lung compressing the heart. Pressure building with every breath. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and her body answered it before her mind caught up. A resident, the younger one, Martinez, had paged her 20 minutes earlier. His voice uncertain. I'm worried about his breathing. His oxygen keeps dropping. Hannah had listened to the doubt in those words the way she'd once listened for IED triggers in the Sangin Valley. The fear underneath. The not knowing. She'd told him to page Dr. Hargrove immediately. Protocol. Procedure. The chain of command that kept hospitals running and kept doctors in charge. Dr. Hargrove had arrived 7 minutes later, walking into the general's room with the confidence of a man who owned the space. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather. He'd looked at the monitor, O2 sat at 74, and frowned. Not at the numbers. At the inconvenience. Let's get an X-ray, he'd said. Probably just anxiety. Give him something to calm down. He turned to leave. Casual. Dismissive. Hannah had met his eyes. His tracheas deviated. That's not anxiety. I'll order the imaging, Hargrove had said. Not a question. Not a discussion. A statement wrapped in authority. He'd walked out. The residents had nodded. Followed orders. Nobody moved to do anything else because the doctor had spoken, and that was how this world worked. Now his oxygen was 68 and falling. Now the general's lips were turning blue at the edges. Now Hannah stepped forward. Not around Hargrove. Past him. The distinction mattered. She moved like a woman walking through smoke, deliberate, unstoppable, making no aggressive gesture that would give anyone grounds to stop her. Just absolute clarity of purpose. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Hargrove's hand shot out. What are you doing? You're not. Second intercostal space, Hannah said. Not to him. To the room. To the residents frozen in their panic. Her voice had changed. The careful, deferential nurse who apologized for existing had been replaced by something else. Someone else. A voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, steady, and capable of moving mountains. Mid-clavicular line. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Martinez moved before Hargrove could countermand. His hands shaking but moving. He pressed the angiocath into her open palm. Hannah had already palpated the space between the ribs. The anatomy was the same whether she was kneeling in a muddy compound in Helmand Province or standing in a climate-controlled hospital room. She didn't hesitate. Didn't explain. Didn't ask permission. Muscle memory took over. The kind of muscle memory that came from practicing something 1,000 times because the 1,001st time might mean the difference between someone going home and someone going into a flag-draped box. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. Smooth. Decisive. No tremor in her hands, hands that had held dying men in the sand, that had wrapped tourniquets in the dark, that had learned long ago that hesitation was just another word for death. The plastic catheter slid over the metal needle. She withdrew the needle. And then she heard it. The hiss of air escaping. It was a small sound. Almost inaudible under the chaos of the monitor and the ventilator and the whispered profanity Dr. Hargrove was muttering from his corner. But Hannah heard it like a hymn. Air rushing out of the collapsed space, pressure releasing, the general's heart finally able to move again. The monitor's rhythm steadied. The rate dropped from 142 to 118 to 106. Breathing became easier. The blue tint retreated from the general's lips. Hannah watched the oxygen saturation climb. 72, 78. 84, 88. 94. The general's eyes opened. His hand moved. His breathing, still labored, still dependent on machines, but breathing. Alive. For the second time, she'd pulled him back from the edge. For the second time, his life had depended on someone choosing action over orders, courage over compliance. She didn't look at Hargrove. Didn't acknowledge the way his face had gone white, then purple, then a shade of red that couldn't be healthy. Didn't give him the satisfaction of her fear or her triumph. Just stepped back from the bed, handed the empty catheter wrapper to a resident, and said quietly, "Monitor his vitals every 15 minutes. Page me if anything changes." Then she turned and walked out of the room like a woman who'd just made a terrible mistake. Because she had. Within 30 minutes, Hargrove was on his phone. Hannah heard about it from a nurse who overheard him in the stairwell, his voice tight and controlled in a way that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. "Dr. Mitchell? It's David Hargrove from Oak Creek. Yes, about that insubordination matter we discussed. No, it escalated. She disregarded direct orders during a critical procedure. VIP patient. Potential liability nightmare. I'm recommending immediate termination." Pause. Yes, I understand the PR implications. That's exactly what I'm saying. The sooner she's gone, the sooner this disappears. Hannah documented everything. That was what she did. That was all she'd ever done. She documented the general's vitals, the procedure, the timeline. She wrote it all in her meticulous, careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had been filling charts at Oak Creek Memorial for 3 years without anyone paying attention to the dozens of billing discrepancies she'd flagged. The same handwriting that would become evidence in ways she couldn't yet imagine. By 4 p.m., her phone rang. HR brief and final. "MS Clarke, we need you to come to the administrative office immediately." Not a request. She knew what a command sounded like when she heard one. The walk down the corridor felt different in scrubs she knew she'd never wear again. Colleagues who'd sat beside her at lunch last week avoided her eyes. Word traveled fast in hospitals. The nurse who'd already saved a 4-star general and lived to regret it. Better not to be associated. Better not to ask questions. Better to keep your head down and your paycheck coming. Security met her on the 3rd floor. 2 guards she recognized but had never spoken to. "Your badge, please," the taller one said. Professional. Not unkind. Just doing the job. She surrendered it, the plastic card that had defined her existence at Oak Creek Memorial for 3 years. It clicked once in the scanner. Access denied. Her locker was on the 4th floor. They let her empty it under supervision. Her personal items fit in a cardboard box. A coffee mug with a faded lighthouse. A framed photo of her son from 2 years ago. And the boots. The worn combat boots that held the weight of 19 years. She'd brought them to the hospital once, 6 months ago, when she'd done inventory on the things that actually mattered. They sat in her locker ever since because she couldn't bear to leave them at home where her son might find them, and she couldn't bear to throw them away because they were the only honest thing she owned. She placed them gently on top of the other items. The cardboard box was heavy with more than just objects. The parking lot was cold. Norfolk in November was a particular kind of harsh, wind off the water, the smell of salt and diesel exhaust mixing with the antiseptic smell she couldn't wash off her skin even when she tried. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before starting the engine. Just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The radio came on when she turned the key, some song about heroes that she shut off before it could finish the first verse. She drove home in silence. Her son Marcus was at the kitchen table when she arrived, homework spread across the surface. 13 years old, with his father's dark hair and Hannah's grey eyes. The eyes that had seen too much already because his mother had come home from Sangin and brought the nightmares with her. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted instantly. Kids knew things. They could read pain the way soldiers read terrain, instantly, instinctively, with an accuracy that no test could measure. Mom. His pencil dropped. Why are you home early? Hannah opened her mouth. Closed it. The words wouldn't come. How do you explain to your child that you've lost everything because you saved someone? How do you explain that heroism has an expiration date? That the moment you stop being invisible is the moment everything falls apart? She set the cardboard box on the table. Her hands were shaking. She'd never shaken in front of Marcus before. Not once. She tried. Failed. The tears came without permission, sliding down her face while her son watched in horror. Horror not because he hated her, but because in 13 years, he'd never seen his mother cry. Not when his father had called from his new life in Seattle with a new family. Not when the nightmares had gotten bad enough that she'd stopped sleeping in beds. Not even when the VA therapist had suggested that her silence might be depression instead of strength. Marcus moved toward her slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. Mom, what happened? She couldn't answer. So she just pulled him close, and they sat in the kitchen of the quiet house where she'd finally thought she could heal. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Marcus pulled back and saw the boots in the cardboard box. He reached for them with the curiosity only a child could summon. The moment his small hands lifted one boot, when he felt the weight of the metals inside, metal pressing against fabric, the years of service compressed into the space of his palm, everything changed. He looked at her with a question in his eyes that she'd spent 13 years trying to avoid answering. Mom, what are these? Before she could respond, before she could find the words she'd buried for so long, her phone buzzed. A single text from an unknown number, the Pentagon is making some calls. Don't turn off your phone. Security arrived at the 5th-floor nursing station at 4:51 p.m., their badges catching the fluorescent glare. Hannah Clarke stood with them, her hospital badge already in their hands, deactivated. 2 decades of silent healing, of holding fractured lives together in rooms where no one asked her name, ended in the time it took to walk from the surgical wing to the employee exit. The escort was technically a courtesy, professional, not punitive, but it landed like a verdict. Dr. Hargrove watched from the stairwell above, his expression the satisfied calm of a man who had just buried a problem. She didn't look back at him. The rain hammered the parking lot as she drove toward her empty house, hand steady on the wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Her son Marcus found her at the kitchen table at 6:31 p.m. He was 13 now, old enough to read the shape of devastation in a mother's spine, young enough to still ask the questions that broke adults. Mom? Why are you home? His voice was small, the voice of a child who had learned early not to ask too much, not to demand explanations for the weight adults carried. Hannah's eyes were red, the kind of red that comes from holding still for too long, from not letting the body express what the mind refuses to acknowledge. She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't trust her voice yet. Marcus set his backpack down slowly, watching her the way soldiers watch a position before moving through it. He was her son, he recognized the shape of survival. Mom, what happened? She reached for him without words, pulled him close, and let the kitchen fall silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant percussion of rain on the roof. No words existed that fit. So she held him instead, this boy who would grow to understand that sometimes the world punishes people not for what they do wrong, but for refusing to do wrong when it costs them everything. By 11 p.m., Marcus was asleep in his room. Hannah sat in the dark, her phone face up on the table, waiting for a call that hadn't come. The next morning, Marcus moved through the hospital lobby of Oak Creek Memorial with the deliberate pace of someone on a mission that transcended logic. The board's emergency meeting was happening on the second floor, the same administrative suite where they had scheduled Hannah's termination hearing for later that week, a formality, she'd been told, but she understood what formality meant in this context. Marcus carried the pair of worn combat boots, boots that had walked through Sangin Valley, through minefields and casualty zones, boots that smelled of dust and memory and the particular silence that follows violence. The boots that contained everything his mother had never told him. Security moved to intercept him. "Son, this is a restricted area. You need to." Marcus didn't stop walking. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear and held the same anchor point his mother's carried when she spoke under pressure. "I'm Marcus Clarke. My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. They need to see these." He held the boots forward. The security officer's radio crackled. In that moment, the entire institutional knowledge of Oak Creek Memorial shifted. The board chair's voice came through the intercom, confused and then urgent, "Bring him in." The silence in the conference room when Marcus entered was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. Board members, 7 of them, including Chairman Richardson, turned from their papers and screens. Dr. Hargrove's empty chair sat at the far end of the table. The board had been discussing liability, discussing how to proceed with the fraud investigation that the FBI had initiated the moment Hannah's documentation had been flagged as suspiciously thorough. They had been debating whether to terminate her or suspend her pending the federal inquiry. Now a teenager stood before them holding combat boots. Chairman Richardson stood slowly and took the boots from Marcus's hands with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. His fingers trembled as he opened the first boot. The medals fell into his palm, medals stacked in careful order, each one telling a story compressed into bronze and ribbon and citation. He read the first one aloud, his voice cracking on the second line, "Bronze Star with Valor. For actions under fire in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, 2009. The room held its breath. Purple Heart. Awarded twice. His voice rose, gaining authority and weight. Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism in direct support of combat operations. By the time Richardson finished reading, his voice had traveled through the open door of the conference room, down the administrative hallway, down the stairwell, and into the ears of every staff member within 50 feet. A Navy SEAL commander, Captain Graves, call sign a breaker, stood at the window wearing full dress uniform, here to testify to the general's cardiac progress. He had known Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke for 14 years. He stepped into the conference room and began to name each decoration aloud, his voice rising to fill the space like a military formation. Bronze Star with Valor. Pause. Purple Heart, first injury, Sangin Valley, 2009. Pause. Purple Heart, second injury, Kona Province, 2010. Pause. Navy Cross. Highest honor for a sailor. For extraordinary heroism. His voice didn't break. It strengthened. It became a testimony, a declaration, a salute rendered in sound. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hargrove. That wasn't the moment that ended him. At 8:48 a.m. on that same morning, as the board was processing the revelation in the conference room upstairs, 2 FBI agents walked onto the 5th floor of Oak Creek Memorial. Special Agent Torres was carrying a laptop. Special Agent Kim carried nothing but the calm authority of federal law enforcement. They had been investigating the hospital's billing patterns for 3 months, ever since Hannah Clarke's meticulous patient documentation had revealed statistical impossibilities. Certain procedures were being billed at premium codes. Equipment costs were inflated by 340%. Kickbacks to Dr. Hargrove's personal accounts amounted to $847,000 over 18 months. The fraud was elegant. The fraud was systematic. The fraud was also federal. Dr. Hargrove was in his office when they appeared. "We'd like to discuss some billing patterns, Doctor. 15 minutes of your time, or we can continue this downtown with your attorney present." The words were courteous. The context was inescapable. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone, made excuses about a call he needed to take, about board business. Kim didn't move from the doorway. Torres set the laptop on his desk and opened a spreadsheet. Hargrove's face went pale. He could see his own emails. He could see the kickback transfers. He could see the inflated codes highlighted in red. "I want a lawyer," he said. The agents exchanged a glance. Torres nodded toward the door. "After you, Doctor." What Hargrove didn't know was that the board chairman had already been contacted. What Hargrove didn't know was that Torres and Kim had a federal warrant to monitor his digital activity the moment they entered the building. What Hargrove didn't understand, even as he was being escorted to a holding area, was that his network had already evaporated. The board members who owed him favors had just learned that those favors were built on fraud. The hospital director who had smiled at his charity galas had just reviewed the evidence. The colleagues who had protected him were now protecting themselves. Panic tastes like metal and adrenaline. Hargrove felt it hit his system as the holding room door closed. He requested to use the bathroom. The agents permitted it. He was not under arrest yet, not technically. This was a voluntary interview, they had said, though the federal warrant hanging over his head made the word voluntary meaningless. The bathroom was on the 4th floor. He walked past the nursing station where Sarah and the other nurses avoided his eyes. The silence was absolute. He made it to his private office on the 5th floor. The door locked behind him. His hands moved across the keyboard with the desperation of a man watching his entire existence collapse in real time. He opened Hannah Clarke's personnel file. He began to backdate performance reviews, to fabricate incident reports, to construct a false history of problematic behavior that might discredit her documentation, might make her testimony suspect, might give him leverage in whatever legal firestorm was coming. His fingers flew across the keys. The document printer hummed to life. He was typing so fast he didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. He didn't hear the door open. Agents Torres and Kim stood in the frame with hospital IT security. Torres's voice was the calmest sound Hargrove had ever heard. "Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and attempted evidence tampering. Stand up slowly." The handcuffs clicked. Hargrove's expensive watch, the one he had flashed during board meetings, the one that cost more than a month of Hannah's salary, caught the light one final time. They walked him through the administrative wing. Word had spread like wildfire. Staff lined the hallways. The nursing station on the 4th floor went silent as he passed between the agents. Sarah, who had mouthed "I'm sorry" to Hannah in the break room days before, had tears streaming down her face. Nurses who had abandoned Hannah at lunch watched their destroyer in handcuffs. The elevator doors opened. The walk to the lobby took 4 minutes. Security footage captured every step, Hargrove in handcuffs, head down, his expensive watch visible, his authority gone, his network scattered, his career ending not with the quiet retirement he had imagined but with the thunderous public humiliation of a federal perp walk. The footage would be watched 847 times by staff in the first week. It would become institutional memory, the story told during new hire orientations, the time a doctor thought he could manipulate a nurse and didn't understand who he was actually trying to destroy. It would be the moment Oak Creek Memorial learned that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. 2 hours later, the board chairman called Hannah. His voice was different now, respectful, shaken, aware that he had nearly destroyed a woman while a man they had trusted was systematically defrauding the hospital. "Ms. Clarke, we need you to come in. Immediately. We have a conversation that's a long time overdue." Hannah sat on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, rain falling in sheets around her. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes." She hung up and stepped outside, letting the rain soak through her clothes, and for the first time in 2 days, she breathed like she wasn't drowning. Now subscribe to the channel for more stories about the quiet people who change everything. Like this video if you believe the truth always surfaces. And comment, what would you have done if you held a secret that powerful?